This conference will now be recorded.
There's not a lot of clarity going on. So what we will do is we'll look at the way people respond to change as individuals and what we can do as people professionals or managers to support people in the best way we can. So it's very much about the individual we're going to be looking at this here as opposed to organizational change. I have got webinars that I'm running on things like organizational change. As I say, to those of you who've just been joining, I try to keep these to about 30 minutes. Therefore, we can only take little bite-sized chunks. So that's what this particular one is about. This quote I've used before though, and I think it's just very key in terms of how we react to change really depends on how it's presented to us. If we feel like we're being pushed into something, we have no say in it, and we don't understand why, that's when you get people being resistant to change or denying change. Now, it's so important, I believe, for us all to take ownership for doing change better. Um, those of us who've been involved in looking at change in the past, you'd see to do with technology change, there are regular quotes which are saying that 70% of change initiatives fail down to people issues. And that's the sort of thing that you typically hear people saying in terms of broad change. Now, my concern at the moment is the fact that, yes, I think we've got people to accept going into change. You think about the change curve that we'll talk about in a moment. As we went into lockdown, there's certain messages that the government put over which really landed well. And there was lots of clarity about going into lockdown as to what we needed to do, what we weren't allowed to do, and why we needed to do it. What my observation is right now is there is lots of ambiguity about how we come out of it. Now, that actually is really quite concerning, I believe, if we're the custodians of people, because there's going to be confusion and potential more anxiety. Because where there's ambiguity, then those people who are less comfortable in dealing with ambiguity and coming up with their own clarity are going to look to us as leaders in organisations for clarity, because it isn't coming through so clearly from the government, because they seem to be having mixed messages. That is a separate observation I would make on change teams. All right, if we're ever in an organizational change, I think that's really, really important is making sure that we're all saying the same, we're on the same story, we all have the same position. And it seems at the moment the cabinet don't have that, and they're not giving the same answers to the same questions. That's what we need to do differently in the organizations that we're in, but that's more about organizational change and messaging. What I'm going to focus in on is the sort of behaviors and individual change that you might experience yourself, or be finding that people that you're working with might be experiencing. So the change curve. So who's come across the change curve? And if you have come across the change curve, I'm curious, pop in the chat, where would you position yourself in terms of the stage? In fact, I'll let you know. So you can say yes in the chat if you've come across the change curve before, and say no if you haven't, because that will help me understand into how much detail to explain it. So when I'm saying the change curve, and I'll show you more about this. So the change curve looks like a couple of people said yes, yes, yes so far. Good. Okay, so I'm not going to go into lots of detail about it. So far, as everyone's heard of it. So in that case, I'll go straight onto it in a seminar. So you've all heard of it. So where it comes from, the change curve or the transition curve, it originated in the 60s from a lady called Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who wrote about the emotions that we go through during a bereavement. So it was applied very much to loss, so emotional loss. And then many people have looked at it in context of other broader change, and this is how it's been adapted, and there's been lots of adaptations. So it's been adapted from some of the terminology in relation to grief for more of a business terminology, and some of the terms are the same and some of them are slightly different for if you were going to study the Kubler-Ross change curve. So with any change, and the concept and the model is really saying that everybody is going to go through change, as in these are the natural stages that we all go through. What differs is the pace at which we go through them. And the pace might be dictated by how much we like the change, how involved we are in the change, to what degree we think it's a good idea, because some change can be positive. So our ability to go through this change will go through, it would vary in terms of pace. And it will also vary as to whether or not we stick in certain phases or if we go back stages. So it isn't a one-way street. It is possible for us to oscillate backwards and forwards across a change curve before we get to commitment. And of course, it is possible for people to be stuck. You might have heard of things like people stuck in denial and things like that. So I've got some examples we'll look at. Now, you've probably thought about this in relation to organizational change, and one is saying for restructures in a sort of theoretical point, but it's really quite real in terms of what you'll have seen. And I'll use an example of us going into lockdown just because it's so current for us. So the sorts of things that you might have heard. So someone right at the start of going into lockdown would be someone saying, well, if I keep my head down, these sort of things, it's just another flu. What's so special about coronavirus? It's fine for us to sunbathe in the park. I don't get it, as long as social distancing, why should we not be able to do it? So that sort of denial about buying into the behaviors. And people at the start there were lots of behaviors like that where people didn't really get it. And where I believe that the government was quite good at this was they started to explain the why, and they created a vision. And they explained to us that science was saying that this particular virus was 3 times more dangerous or contagious than other viruses. They explained to us that in terms of the vision, which is why we should do this, we needed to stay at home, save lives, save the NHS. Now, we're really passionate as a nation about the NHS. That's quite a compelling vision. So those sort of messages helped to overcome the denial, push people into resistance where they might be, oh God, but how am I going to do? Well, we can't go into lockdown. I don't have the tools to work remotely. I don't think I've got the time to get set up properly. Then people went into a bit of sort of, oh my goodness, where are we? I'm scared to go out. Things will never be the same again. I'm never going to be able to see my family, sort of a low point. And some people, this is where people are in a danger zone if they stay on the left-hand side of the curve. And then people, as they come through, in terms, let's say lockdown, okay, so which collaboration technology is best? Perhaps could I do this for home? What priorities should I focus on now? Have my priorities changed? Let's do a team quiz on a Friday. Those are people starting to explore the differences and looking to the future. And then at the top, you can see that the people committed. Okay, I've cracked it, internet shopping. I've worked out how to do it. I know how to manage my teams, and they can update me through the system. This is actually working better than ever before. I'm loving this. I'm getting my exercise done, not missing the morning commute. So those are people who've reached all the way through into commitment to this new way of working. That was all well and good. Well, we needed to stay in lockdown. So lots of people have moved through to commitment, and you could see why. Just using this as a model, though, you can see that one thing to be aware of with this change, and that's me just using lockdown, this could be any change, is that when we are a change agent and we're trying to help people, denial and commitment, these are thought bubbles. A lot of that is done in people's heads. So if people don't like a change and decide they're just going to carry on ignoring it and doing what they've always done, that denial can actually look or be mistaken for commitment because they're not actually actively pushing against the change. And that's an interesting one, because if you have, when you're communicating any kind of change, those people, and I know there's HR people on here who are now going to have to talk to people and answer questions that they don't have clarity from the government, and be able to make up our own answers. When people go, okay, well, how am I going to social distance? I haven't got a bike to cycle to work, or how am I supposed to social distance in our workplace? It's only 4 foot square. All of that kind of language where people are pushing back is resistant language. But actually, we should see that as highly positive, because the great thing is they're telling us what their problems are. They are telling us their concerns. When people are using that sort of thing, then we can empathize and say, okay, I understand why you're concerned about that. And we can talk to them about, well, how do you think we could solve this problem? Or what might work for you? Would different working hours work? Or what sort of solutions do you think we could accommodate to keep the business going, but to keep people safe? So actually, when people, those most difficult people who use your time up, it's easy for me to say, but if you can see that as positive because they've moved out of denial, at least you know what the problems are. The issue is they're fixated in the past. They're trying to push away at the future and to stick. They're trying to reinforce staying in for now lockdown, let's say, because they've got used to it. What we need to do is, okay, so how? So the way we do this is by empathizing. Then we have to move people into exploration and think about how can we move forward. So what could we do? What would collaborate? What might the solution be? We ask people questions, or we listen to them in terms of what sort of possibilities there might be. And by empathizing, we can hopefully move people to the right-hand side of the curve. And exploration is equally noisy, but the positive is that it's actually they've got on with it, they're looking to the future, and then hopefully we move people into commitment. So that's the goal. And I think it's quite a challenging time right now, because we've just had announcements that we're moving um, back into a form of business as usual, but that business as usual varies widely, and it's down to us to come up with the answers, is the way I see it. So if we've got people now and you need to get them back into the workplace, just need to make sure that we need to set those clear expectations about what and how they're going to rejoin the workplace. My biggest point, I would say, actually, just in these times here, is I wouldn't actually announce anything really quickly. Just because the government are saying come back in on Wednesday, I would be inclined to say to people, nothing's changed right now until we've got clarity on how we're going to operate as an organisation. And then once you've got clarity, so you have one message, because what you don't want is it Matt Hancock. It's not Matt. One of the guys keeps contradicting people, in my view, and it's not Matt Hancock. It's Dominic Rubb, I believe. So Boris says one thing, and then Dominic Rubb says something slightly different. That's really, really damaging, I believe. So it's very important that in your organization you can work out what are the top challenges going to be and come up with the standard answers, so that, and even as standard answers are, we're working on that. You're very, we want to make sure that everyone is safe and the business is able to keep on performing. The business is able to survive. So we are coming up with the solutions as we go. So if you have a set of standard answers right now, before you actually tell people to do anything different, I'd be inclined to try and make sure you've got those amongst those of you who are in leadership roles. But looking at more classic change, if it's a change, it's a restructure, then actually, and people are in denial and there's no health reasons why they can't do it, then people are in denial, we have to challenge them. We have to say, look, this change is here to stay, and I can see that you're not doing anything different, or it looks to me like you're wanting to sort of just stay as things are, but actually this is the way we need to change and this is what you need to do differently. So people are in denial, we can't just let them get away with it. We have to challenge that denial with empathy. People who are resisting, rather than feeling that's a bad thing, is actually we just need to empathize with their resistance and then reinforce it with why we need to do this. And once they realize that actually there's a pragmatic reason, then you might find that they start to move through, particularly if you empathize. It's not just about coming up with solutions, but actually just empathize their concerns. Unfortunately, it's still got to happen, and we'd really appreciate it if you could come up with some suggestions as to how it might work. And if you ask those kind of questions, you'll find that people will actually naturally move themselves over into exploration themselves. Those people who are really already starting to come up with solutions, then it's about empowering them, supporting them, asking questions, giving them the tools to solve it themselves, so that they can go for the future and they can lead others through. There are people who go through change much, much faster than others, which I'll talk about in a moment, and it's about moving them into commitment. So that's a change curve. My question to you guys is, where do you see yourselves currently in terms of home working, assuming you're home working, in terms of the lockdown and generally? Were you all in commitment, would you have said? I think we've pretty much got through to commitment. Louise has got commitment. Kerry's got commitment. Yep. So most people have got to that, and therefore let's assume that most of the people that you represent are in the same place. Yeah, Tobias said it depends, sometimes fall into exploration. Do you know, yeah, sometimes it is one of my priorities. I need to remotivate myself, and you hit the slump, you do go back a bit. We've all had days like that, I'm sure. Now, the challenge is we've now got another change curve. So people have got comfortable in this new way of being, and potentially we've got to find out a new way of working. And I guess the interesting thing is, yeah, so all of us are slipped back and forth. So we've experienced, the good thing about that is you feel how that experience. So what we need to know, we know that everyone we work with is going to go through this again. And we're going to have to find out a way to get people committing to the new workplace, whatever that looks like. And there isn't a clear vision, actually, and there's nothing much more compelling than save the NHS. So how do we come up with something? Maybe about how do we keep the business going? How does business survive? Do you have a view as to where your people are likely to be in terms of returning to the workplace, if that is what's going to happen? I know it's quite different for many of you, where they might be in the change curve, or even where you guys are in the change curve. Yeah, mixed, says Becky. I'll let the comments, so keep the comments coming, and I'm going to move now into applying this to personalities. So it is going to be mixed because people are different. And as I say, I don't think the vision is very clear from a government point of view, but maybe that's not down to them in these circumstances. Maybe it's down to us to come up with clarity. My suggestion is don't tell people to do things until you've got, so Jackie's got a mixture of resistance and commitment. It will depend, won't it, as to whether you're asking somebody to come in and people who are very anxious come and work side by side with people when they've been told to isolate for X amount of time. But again, and it might be actually, maybe you guys, your workplaces are going to be different. And then people have got childcare. Yeah, it's not normal, is it? So there's other stuff as well in terms of that, all sorts of complications in terms of the solutions. It is much less clear than during lockdown, says Becky. Some will be keen to keep working from home, others want to get back to the office. So what we think we've got to do is come up with our own sense of clarity as much as possible, because that will stop people resisting the change for change's sake, right? So we have to work out what it is that we need people to do. Is it we want people to take responsibility and think for themselves and make sure they are productive, and rules of engagement? Think about how we can create clarity in our organization. I'll share some of these things. So a lot of people are enjoying home working, struggling balancing childcare, says Paula. Kerry says there's also fears that the organisation may want this to become the new norm. So why do you think people don't like that idea, Kerry? Interesting there. Transport for those who don't drive, says Namana, and also I guess going on, being on transport. So safety. Some people have enjoyed being on the front line, says Paula. There's a split between those who are working with each other in person and those who are working remotely. What business are you in, Paula? That's interesting, because to some of the businesses, let me know the types of businesses you're in as well, because it's that'd be useful for people. Okay, so what I'm going to go into now is look at this in relation to individuals. So again, almost certainly some of you have come across Myers-Briggs type indicator, a personality questionnaire. Let me know if you are familiar with Myers-Briggs. If you say you've heard of it, very familiar, even know your type. So if you know your Myers-Briggs type, then that means you know pretty well. Then put your Myers-Briggs type in. Kerry's saying the concern is people, the choice being removed, and the value of face-to-face collaboration. So Helen's very familiar. Okay, so Paula was in local authority, so some people were redeployed to work in hubs. Mariana, yes, and I know my type. Go on and type it in there, Mariana. Yeah, familiar with it, but don't know own type. Leanne, so tell us what you are then, guys, if you know what it is. So Mariana's an INFJ. Okay, let's see whether you agree with the interpretation I've got here. And I've got an ESFJ from Leanne. So we've got some really familiar people. And then those of you go, usually people go, oh yes, I know Myers-Briggs, and they go, what are the letters again? That's my most common response. Anyway, it doesn't matter too much. The only reason, now Myers-Briggs has its critics and it has its lovers, all right? Any tool for me that helps us appreciate how people vary is really, really useful, because it just gives us an awareness, because we've all got different types and preferences, and that means that our response to change or any circumstance is going to be different from somebody who has different preferences, and it just becomes a model, therefore, that I think is useful to us to refer to. And if you have someone who's let's say resisting change or in denial, then some of these will actually play into it. I was reading some research on the there are definitely personality factors that play into people feeling anxious or otherwise. I'll go into that when I deal with anxiety later. So if we talk about Myers-Briggs, there are 4 different dichotomies. So basically there's 8 sections to it. And it doesn't matter whether you know someone's overall type and how it comes together. I'm not going to be that complex about it. But what you find is you've got your difference between extroverts and introverts. So extroverts, they get their energy from externally, and introverts tend to be energized internally. What does that look like when you're giving people change, when you're communicating change? Is that the extroverts will want to talk the change through, they'll discuss with others, they'll enjoy interacting and discussing as a group. They may well on the surface look like they've got to, well, they will be the ones who will, if they're in resistance, you will hear what they're resisting about, and they will be quite dominant. And if they're in exploration, they'll also be good at ideas. So if they're extrovert, they'll create noise and they'll react quite quickly to the change. They'll think quite quickly probably, and their responses will be faster, and you'll have an idea of where they are because they'll tell you. Introverts, on the other hand, they like to think and process the change. And what's interesting about that is you might think that they're in denial just because they're not saying anything, but they could well be in commitment because they've thought about it, they've seen the logic, thought it all through internally, and got all the way through to commitment. So you never assume just because someone's quiet that they're in denial. It's only if you hear from them and and they kind of go, they're blocking it, or they're saying things like, oh well, um, I think the way things are just fine. I'll wait until I'm told to do something different. Type terminology was what would tell you they're in denial. The key with this is that if you tell someone about a change, really what we need to do is give both types chance to respond. So extroverts may have their questions straight away. Introverts need to have the opportunity to go away and think about it. If you want people to bring their questions to the table when you're communicating a change, you need to give them some information up front so they can digest it, and then they'll bring their questions with them. In terms of group, so extroverts are happy in a group. Introverts would probably prefer some smaller group or one-to-one discussions. Common sense, of course, lots of these because you'll experience both parts. But when you think about it like this, when you're communicating any kind of change, you need to create the environment where both types can get what they want. That's the point of this. The next type is this is about people take in the world. This is how people take in information. So you've got people who have a sensing preference, and they tend to be pretty methodical. They're practical, they're organized, and they will want facts and details about the change. So sensing preference right now, in terms of the guidance, where you're seeing people going, it's as clear as mud and I've not got any facts, this will be driving sensors insane because there's no real examples, there's no case studies, no facts and figures, no details, no employment law. Really, that's quite stressful for sensors. People who've got intuition preferences, well, they are much more likely to be making up their own answers. And actually, in general terms, people with intuition preference, they're drawn to change. They are sometimes guilty of change for change's sake, whereas sensors prefer things to be the same in many ways. So again, it does depend on the change. So in certain new changes, intuition, people with that, they are likely to make links, they can see the end game, they are future orientated. So they may well race around that change curve and be an explorational commitment, as long as they can see a positive future. The sensors will be a little bit more cautious and they will want to know you've thought it through. So again, my point earlier about not saying anything too early for people because they'll make their own answers up. The sensors would want to know that you've thought it through and be assured about the facts and the detail. Moving on from that, we've then got thinking and feeling. This is actually in relation to how we make decisions. So for somebody almost to decide whether a change is good or bad, which is what a lot of the things as to whether people decide that it's in their interests, someone with a thinking preference, they'll want to know the logical rationale for it. And again, in these circumstances, it's like, well, actually, we have to get a certain number of people back into the workplace, otherwise the business will not survive. That's a very logical rationale. Whereas the feeling preference, they will very much want to understand the impact on others. So the motivation for them to get back into the workplace might be, well, we need to get a sense of normality in order to support people's mental health. They're also going to be very, very concerned about people issues, people on the front line, people being put in danger. Both parties will be, but just in a different way. So it's just more of an emotional, values-driven sense in terms of people who have a feeling preference. So facts, figures, logical argument, that works fine for people with a thinking preference, and they'll probably just suck it up and get on with the change because it's what you need to do. It's a kind of stoic way. Those in feeling preference, they are going to feel others' pain. All right, they're very aware of other people's emotions and they will suffer on behalf of others almost psychologically unless they feel that you've considered everyone's case. So what you need to do is, it's not just for their feelings, it's actually people with a feeling preference are bothered about the feelings of others. So they need to know that as a business, we have considered other people's feelings and we're looking after everybody. And then finally, those with a judging and perceiving preference. So if you're judging, this is about almost how we like to live our life, and it's about, do we like closure? People with a judging preference, it's not about being judgmental, it's about actually we like to get things done and dusted, signed, sealed, delivered, decided, and get closure on it. So they want to know, the people who are asking about how we're going to come out of the lockdown, 3 weeks ago, they wanted certainty, they wanted closure, they wanted decisions in a time when actually you couldn't really do that. So that was a very judging type of question. So they'll be looking for clear timelines, structured communication, and definite decisions. Those are the perceiving preference. They actually, you would argue, are more change orientated, like intuition. So they like options and possibilities. They don't like things being closed down because it restricts their possibilities. They think, oh, okay, well, we could try this. Oh, maybe have a hybrid working environment. They're coming up with different ways, and they're much more comfortable with ambiguity. So they'll be relatively relaxed in that kind of environment about how things are fixed, probably go with the flow. They'll be flexible. Those are the judging preference. They want certainty, and when you can't give them certainty, what you can do is, I will give you an update by Friday afternoon at 3 o'clock. Even if we don't know what we're going to do next, we will give you an update. So you can always communicate something, even if it's the fact that we don't know the answer yet. This is how far we've got. We've asked this expert. We're looking at how we can reorganize the workplace. We've got a few strategies in place, and I will give you a further update next Wednesday. So actually, that's how we need to manage judges, to give them the timelines, even if we don't have the answers, so they can rely on some sort of definitive answers. Sorry, some sort of structured, reliable communication. So those of you who knew your types, it was Leanne and Mariana. In terms of that interpretation of change, how does they feel to you? Does that feel like, does that resonate with you in terms of that, or is there anything you disagree with in terms of your preferences? I realise obviously you're a combination of all four, and I'm not going to get into 16 different types of change. The purpose really of me sharing these with you is just to help us, all of us will have a preference for one or the other of them, to make sure that when you're dealing with others, that you're able to flex that type, or ensure that your organisation isn't handling change in just one way. So we want to try and make it as open as possible for all parties. So I've got a couple more slides in terms of summarising this. One of them is going outside of personality, although you could argue it is a personality trait, which is the trait they talk about, the big 5 personality traits, and one of them is neuroticism, but you have to be careful, it's not calling people neurotic, but people who have this kind of trait are much more likely to feel quite anxious. And there are going to be people who are feeling really anxious, let's say they have that trait anyway and they've got health issues, or they're shielding people. Then we need to bring every single people skill that we have and deal with those guys with particular empathy. I think the key here is being patient. We can't expect them to get on with the program overnight, ideally. It is going to be gradual. It's not like an organizational change when we're doing a big restructure. We've got a timeline. We've got to make X number of people put at risk by such and such a date, and it's driven outside. This actually, if we can, then we need to give people a bit of time and be a little bit flexible. If we can create pockets of clarity and certainty, that's usually helpful. And what I mean by that is tell people what is going to remain the same. So actually what's going to remain the same is that you are still going to have your laptop and you're going to be working from home until at least the end of May in terms of this, or you will be able to be shielded, or you will still have this working team and we're still going to have these meetings on a Friday, and I'll be your HR business partner. Whatever it is, if you can give them pockets of clarity and certainty, because often people who are anxious start to focus on uncertainty, take them back into what certainty is. And that's a similar thing in terms of saying, encourage people to focus on what they can control. What is in their control? Is it may be personal or work? Can they control what time they get up in the morning, when they do their exercise, how they organize their desk, who they interact with, all those sort of things, what they eat? Those are things that they can control. So focusing them on positive things that they can control can help them in terms of managing their anxiety. Often anxious people, they overgeneralize. They'll say, oh, well, everybody else is saying that we've got to, get the tube into work and be in by 9 o'clock, whatever, or distortions. It is important that you try to block those sort of things. So who's everybody? I say, let me tell you what actually the message is. So those sort of things, we do need to drill in where people overgeneralize things or distort facts, because they just hear things differently. Be reassuring. Actually, don't forget, maybe people need professional support. If you have got mental health first aiders, or occupational health, if someone you're really concerned about them, consider that. And actually, very, very importantly, look after your own mental health, especially if you're on F preference in Myers-Briggs, and which Leanne and Mariana are. There's a tendency there where you might almost empathize so much that you feel responsible for them. It's not your responsibility to solve their anxiety. You can help them do it, but you can't be effective for other people if it's affecting your well-being. So really be careful, because there's going to be lots of anxiety around, to find a way to look after yourself and let go of other people's emotion. Don't take it on for yourself. So my overall summary is, listen to people's concerns with change, because that's often, if we listen to that, that's often resistance. And by listening to them, we can explain the facts, including the rationale or the why for something. We can paint a picture of the future, and that will move them onto the right-hand side of that change curve. Ask how people are feeling. Don't be scared of the emotions, because if we get it out, that's how we understand if people are in denial or if people are actually anxious. And by asking how people are feeling, even if you can't solve it, we can empathize. And actually, once people feel heard and understood, they will naturally move themselves over onto the right-hand side of the change curve. They understand that something has to happen, then they will go, oh, well, I suppose it had to happen sooner or later. We can't stay in lockdown forever. They'll start to say those kind of things. And actually, it's quicker to empathize and allow people to move themselves. And they're probably much more likely to stay on the right-hand side of the curve if you do it that way, than it is to say, well, we can't stay on lockdown forever. And they'll go, well, I don't see why. Then if we kind of try to solve problems for people when they're in resistance, they will just put up more resistance. If we empathize, then very often they will move themselves forwards. Then you've got your super early adopters who bombed around that change curve. Then give them the tools, give them the solutions, help them make up solutions, and lead other people through. With any change, we need a change team or league to do that. And finally, just make sure, as I said earlier, you look after yourself, because we're all going through it. So my view is that we all have capability to be change superheroes. That was just a little aspect of this. If you want to know more about this, I say my book's launching next week. I'm doing a virtual launch on the 20th of May. We'll make the slides available to you. You're very welcome to join up to a virtual launch, however it will go. We've got a $1.99 Kindle version that will be available for 24 hours on the 21st of May. So you can get hold of that, and we'll, if you sign, if you want to email me, then we'll make sure you go on that waiting list, and we'll remind you. And there's various other change information going on. And then in terms of future webinars, there will be more. We've been running webinars quite full on for the last couple of weeks. This one is Change Superhero, is more about the superpowers of change. There'll be a bit of new information in that that's different to what we've covered already, but it's slightly different. And this is more about organizational large-scale change. So we'll look at Kotter's 8-step model and how to freeze and unfreeze people. And I'm working on other content as it comes through. So please feel free to ask any questions. If there's any specific questions that you'd like me to try and support with, I'm really happy to try and support you. Do contact me. I'll put my contact details up. Do link in, or if you're on social media, get connected. And that's all I had to share, but really happy to, as I say, take any questions. Do feel free to enter them in the chat now, or feel free to drop off if you need to go and get other stuff done as well. I'll just give it a moment, because sometimes it takes a bit of time for it to come through. You're welcome, Tobias. Here's Curry. Yeah, thanks, guys. Actually, I should. Was it you? So I don't know if it's what you were expecting. Good. Okay. Thanks, Becky. Yeah. Any tips? Anything you'd like me to do differently, or anything which would be helpful on future webinars? Do let me know that as well. Great, Paula. Yes, we'll send you the slides, Jackie. They'll come out to you. And there's also going to be a recording, so there'll be a link to it as well. Thanks, Louise. Thanks, Kate. Thanks, Namana. Nice to see you guys virtually, as ever. Thank you, Kerry. Right, I'm going to close down the meeting now.